In the darkest years, only our poor neighbor Vietnam came to save our nation. That single sentence, printed in a Cambodian newspaper in 1989, echoes like a declaration of truth. It is more than gratitude. It places morality at the very center of the story. And it forces us to pause with a difficult question. Why would a nation devastated by decades of war, exhausted in both people and resources, take up arms once more and cross a border to intervene in another country's tragedy? This is not a question for abstract political theory. It is a question of conscience and strategy, two forces intertwined in one of the most consequential decisions in modern Southeast Asian history. Right after April 30th, 1975, as the liberation flag flew over the South, Vietnam entered a new era of reunification and reconstruction. People expected a period of healing, time to rebuild homes, bury loved ones, and finally sit around a warm pot of rice without the echo of bombs overhead. But along the southwest border, flames still burned. And they were not random clashes, they were systematic acts of brutality directed at civilians, a direct threat not only to Vietnam's border security, but to the lives of thousands. From a military standpoint, two principles must be put side by side: self-defense and the obligation to protect civilian lives. In this case, the two became inseparable. The adversary that emerged in this turbulent moment was not merely seeking territorial expansion, it was carrying out a policy of extermination against its own people. Its leadership, driven by radical ideology, had transformed revolutionary ideals into a machine that crushed society from within. We will not yet dive into the massacres or the full extent of the genocide. That comes later. But for now, we must grasp the essential military logic. When an enemy fires upon civilians, destabilizes border regions, and turns the frontier into a permanent conflict zone, no nation can accept a situation in which its citizens are murdered, its farmland raided, and its border villages constantly threatened. Thus, mobilization was not merely a political choice. It became a military necessity to secure the border, prevent escalation, and isolate the source of violence. From the perspective of a military analyst, this decision must be viewed through a dual lens. First is the strategic lens, protecting national security, preventing broader conflict, and eliminating a hostile force that had already crossed the line. Second is the humanitarian lens, stopping the systematic killing of civilians and restoring the minimum conditions for an entire population to survive. Few interventions in modern history intertwine these two objectives so tightly. It was both a just war to defend the border and a large-scale humanitarian rescue mission for a nation facing extinction. But moral clarity does not automatically produce international legitimacy. In the geopolitical climate of the time, Vietnam's actions were easily interpreted through the distortions of Cold War power politics, leading to misunderstanding, suspicion, and condemnation. And that is why the emotional core of the story must be handled with precision, not to justify the war with sentimentality, but to place events in the correct context. A life-or-death decision made only after all peaceful avenues had collapsed. We will not rely on emotional appeals. Instead, we set a clear standard. When diplomacy fails, when civilians suffer at the border, and when a genocidal regime ignores every attempt at peace, military action may become the final and legitimate choice.
In the mid-20th century, as many Southeast Asian nations were struggling to reclaim their independence, Cambodia sought its own revolutionary path. Pol Pot, once a student in France, returned home with a vision of creating a pure agrarian society, one without the bourgeoisie, without cities, without intellectuals. On the surface, it sounded simple, almost like a promise of fairness for the rural poor. But from that deceptively simple idea, Pol Pot built one of the deadliest genocidal machines of the entire 20th century. On April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh. To many, it looked like the day peace finally arrived. In reality, it was the opening act of hell. The entire city was ordered to evacuate. More than 2 million people, patients pulled from hospital beds, students dragged from classrooms, and families torn from their homes, were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers into the countryside. They were told they'd return in 3 days. No one ever did. Pol Pot abolished money, abolished markets, abolished schools, abolished religion, even abolished the family. A society of no money, no education, no religion was born, where only one thing remained: the absolute power of the party enforced by the barrel of a gun. The educated were buried alive, monks were executed, children were turned into informants, tools to accuse their own parents. Fields became labor camps, rice paddies became mass graves. In just 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, an estimated 1.7 to 2 million Cambodians died, nearly a quarter of the entire population. Not from war, but from starvation, torture, forced labor, and executions. They died because of an extremist regime created by their own leaders. But Cambodia's nightmare didn't stop at its borders. Pol Pot didn't just slaughter his own people, he dreamed of rebuilding the Angkor Empire by expanding outward, and he saw Vietnam as a hereditary enemy. In secret speeches, he declared, "If 2 million Cambodians must die to kill 60 million Vietnamese, then so be it." If the words weren't recorded in documents, no one would believe they were real, but they were, and they were carried out in blood. Beginning in 1977, the Khmer Rouge launched wave after wave of attacks into Vietnamese territory. Phu Quoc, Ta Chu, Tay Ninh, An Giang, Long An, peaceful borderlands suddenly became battlegrounds. And the massacre of Ba Chuk in 1978 carved a permanent scar into Vietnam's memory. Over 3,000 civilians, the elderly, women, children, murdered with knives, hammers, axes, burned alive, buried in mass graves. In Tambu Pagoda, hundreds were locked inside and set on fire. Ba Chuk was not just a village, it became a symbol of cruelty beyond imagination. Vietnam did not retaliate immediately. For nearly 2 years, from 1977 to 1978, Vietnam restrained itself, sending delegation after delegation to Phnom Penh, hoping for peace. Every negotiation collapsed. Pol Pot viewed peace as weakness, and Vietnam as an eternal enemy. He vowed to fight until the last Cambodian. From a military perspective, this was a point of no return. Borders violated, civilians slaughtered, national sovereignty attacked. No country can remain silent in the face of such crimes. Strategic analysts later described this moment as the inevitable threshold for counterattack, the point at which the threat had surpassed every diplomatic boundary. Western documents later confirmed that between 1977 and 1978, Khmer Rouge forces launched more than 300 cross-border assaults, using both infantry and artillery. Vietnam was forced to respond, not to conquer territory, but to protect its borders and stop a humanitarian catastrophe spilling directly into its own villages. And when the first Khmer Rouge bullets tore through the roofs of Vietnamese homes, when the screams from Ba Chuk echoed across the Vam Co River, Vietnam understood something important. This was no longer a border dispute. It was a test of human decency. The question was no longer, should we fight? But if we don't fight, who will save them? From that moment, a just war began. Not a war of revenge, but a war to end a genocide.
After months of enduring atrocities and bloody border raids, Vietnam understood one undeniable truth. Peace could not exist as long as evil lingered right at its doorstep. And so, on December 23, 1978, in the dry chill of the Indo-Chinese dry season, the southwestern border counteroffensive officially began. This was not merely a military campaign. It was a statement to history itself. Vietnam had to rise, not for conquest, but to protect life. The operation was led by General Le Trong Chan, one of the most brilliant commanders of the Vietnam People's Army, who had previously directed decisive campaigns during the war against the United States.
Under his command, 3 main army corps, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, were mobilized, working in coordination with military regions 5, 7, and 9, along with the Navy and Air Force Unit 372, a combined arms force of unprecedented scale in the region since 1975. The order was simple and resolute. Strike quickly, resolve cleanly, advance simultaneously. This core strategy aimed to prevent quagmire, destroy the Khmer Rouge forces, and minimize civilian casualties in Cambodia. The Vietnamese forces advanced from multiple directions: Tay Ninh, Long An, Ha Tien, An Giang, piercing deep through the Khmer Rouge's dense defenses. Despite their numerical presence, the Khmer Rouge were poorly equipped, disorganized, and, critically, their morale collapsed rapidly in the face of Vietnam's well-coordinated professional army. In the final days of December 1978, battles erupted across Ha Tien, Kampong Cham, Suai Ring, and Takeo, liberating border regions one by one. Leading the offensive, the 10th Division, known as the Reed Flower Division, moved like a storm, crossing the Mekong River, one of Southeast Asia's most formidable natural obstacles, using precise combined arms tactics involving artillery, armor, and engineering units. The pace was astonishing. In just the first 2 weeks, Vietnamese forces covered nearly 200 kilometers and shattered 19 Khmer Rouge divisions. Then, on the morning of January 7, 1979, after fierce fighting in the outskirts, Phnom Penh was liberated. The Vietnamese flag and the banner of the National United Front for the Salvation of Cambodia flew over a devastated city, once the center of a genocidal machine. Streets littered with the dead, abandoned prison camps, and blood-stained walls testified to the cost of fanaticism and lies. Yet in the midst of the ruins, images of Vietnamese soldiers distributing hard rations to children became a symbol of humanity, an army that came not to occupy, but to save. In less than a month, 18 Khmer Rouge divisions were completely destroyed, Pol Pot's government collapsed, and over 4 million Cambodians were freed from hell. Many Vietnamese soldiers and officers sacrificed their lives, most notably Major General Kim Tuan, the highest-ranking officer to fall on Cambodian soil in March 1979, became a symbol of pure internationalist spirit and selfless dedication. From a military perspective, the southwestern border counteroffensive is recognized as one of the most extensive and effective combined arms campaigns in Southeast Asia since 1945. It demonstrated Vietnam's organizational ability, mobility, and interforce coordination at near-perfect levels. In a remarkably short time, the Vietnamese army not only destroyed an armed regime, but also laid the foundation for the re-establishment of a revolutionary government in Cambodia, opening a new era of stability in the region. Looking back, it is clear this was not merely a victory of firepower or tactics, but a triumph of will and righteousness. An army that had endured 30 decades of brutal war against colonial and imperial powers was still capable, in spirit, organization, and determination, of achieving a new feat, liberating another nation from the grip of genocide. When international journalists asked a Vietnamese soldier on duty in Phnom Penh, "Why are you here?" he simply smiled and replied, "We are here to give them life." That simple answer encapsulates the essence of the campaign, a historic counteroffensive where military strength and humanitarian purpose met, writing a shining chapter of justice in the history of both Vietnam and Cambodia.
After the gunfire fell silent across Cambodia, many assumed that the conflict had finally ended. But for Vietnam, this was only the beginning of a different mission. No longer fighting to destroy, but staying to restore life. After the victory in Phnom Penh, the Vietnamese army did not seize land, install puppet governments, or take any resources. They stayed, not as conquerors, but as friends, as brothers. In a country where nearly 3 million people had perished, thousands of villages had been erased, farmland lay fallow, and orphaned children wandered the streets. The first task of the Vietnamese forces was not to set up bases, but to rebuild schools, hospitals, and temples. Throughout the early 1980s, Tens of thousands of Vietnamese experts, engineers, doctors, and teachers were sent to Cambodia. Alongside volunteer troops, they restored transportation networks, helped farmers till the fields, dug canals, and taught children to read. Temples that had been burned were rebuilt, and surviving monks returned to perform ceremonies under roofs laid by Vietnamese soldiers themselves. Convoys carried millions of Cambodians back to their villages, allowing them to begin life anew from the ashes. For them, the Vietnamese soldiers were no longer figures of war, but helpers, carrying the sick across rivers, sharing every ration of rice and every pill. It was for this reason that the president of the Cambodian National Assembly, Samdech Heng Samrin, spoke with heartfelt gratitude. The Vietnamese army is the Buddhist army. This was not propaganda, but a title given by the Cambodian people themselves, those who had survived hell in deep appreciation. Only a Buddhist army could both wield weapons to defeat evil and wield hoes to sow new life. Yet the paradox of history was clear. As Vietnam sowed life in a neighboring land, it was simultaneously isolated on the international stage. While Vietnam and Cambodia rebuilt after the disaster, China continued to support the remnants of the Khmer Rouge along the border, turning them into a new destabilizing force. The United States and Western countries, caught in the ideological divides of the Cold War, refused to recognize Cambodia's new government and instead supported UN resolutions condemning Vietnam for invading Cambodia. In 1985, sanctions on Vietnam were passed, the beginning of a decade of severe international isolation. The world at that time was divided by political calculation. People debated sovereignty and intervention, but few looked closely at the Cambodian villages where children were returning to school and where the rice paddies were turning green again. One Western journalist wrote, "While humanity debated morality, Vietnamese soldiers quietly tilled the blood-soaked land." It was a paradox, and also the beauty of Vietnamese humanity. A small nation, itself emerging from war, willing to carry a portion of another people's suffering. And amid years of misunderstanding, sanctions, and isolation, Vietnam chose to do what was right. No applause was needed, no recognition required, only that Cambodia might live. After 10 years of steadfast service in a neighboring land, the Vietnamese soldiers finally withdrew completely in September 1989. They left quietly, just as they had arrived. No banners, no spoils of war, leaving behind only a Cambodia that was beginning to heal. Roads were reopened, rice fields flourished, temple bells rang across Phnom Penh, the marks of a war fought not to conquer, but to revive a nation. More than 40 years have passed since January 7, 1979, and Cambodia remains at peace. A nation once on the brink of annihilation is now a member of ASEAN, with a thriving capital and a generation of children growing up in safety, all sparked by Vietnam's humanitarian courage. Today, history recognizes the truth. Without Vietnam, the Cambodian people might not have survived. In 1978, the world remained silent. The United Nations did not intervene. Global powers turned away. Only a poor nation, itself emerging from war, dared to cross political boundaries to save human lives. That war was not fought for territory, resources, or power, but for the survival of a neighbor. It demonstrated the resolve of the Vietnamese people, willing to face isolation, to sacrifice international prestige in order to protect what was right. In a world driven by calculation and self-interest, Vietnam chose the road fewer dared to walk, the path of humanity and justice.
Today, looking back, those soldiers may have grown old, and some rest in foreign soil, but the meaning of their mission still shines. Justice does not come from the words of the powerful, but from the actions of those who dare to do what is right. Compassion conquers brutality. Righteousness is always the brightest sword of the Vietnamese people. These words stand as a pledge from history, a reminder that in every era, Vietnam's strength lies not in weapons, but in the heart. Not everyone may understand, not everyone may recognize it, yet history will remember. For some wars are not fought to claim land nor for glory, but to save the very soul of humanity.